Hello, Math 2. This is Mrs. Bricky, and this video is Unit 8, Lesson 1, Part A. So if you missed class, you'll need to also watch the Part B video. This is only for the first half of class. So we want to multiply together 7x plus 2 and x minus 5. So when you're multiplying binomials or other polynomials together, you want to make sure to distribute. So we start by distributing our 7x. 7x multiplied by x is 7x squared, and 7x multiplied by negative 5 is negative 35x. But we also need to distribute the second term. We need to distribute the 2. So we'll multiply the 2 by both of these terms. 2 times x is 2x, and 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. Now we're finished multiplying, but our answer is not written in simplest form because we have these two terms right here that can be combined. So if we go ahead and combine those two terms, our final answer is 7x squared minus 33x minus 10. And again, that 33 just comes from the negative 35x plus 2x combining. So x minus 5 squared, remember that squaring does not distribute. We can't distribute powers. Squaring is telling us that we need to take that x minus 5 and multiply it by itself. So this is x minus 5 multiplied by x minus 5. So it's really the same sort of problem as the one we just did. And we're going to start by distributing the x. So that gives us x squared minus 5x. And now we're going to distribute this negative 5. So that's a negative 5x when we multiply it together, and negative 5 multiplied by negative 5 is 25. So again, we have some terms in the middle here that can combine. So our final answer is going to lead with x squared. The negative 5x and another negative 5x combine to give us negative 10x. And we have plus 25 as our constant. All right. Well, sorry. Factoring is just the reverse process of what we just did. So instead of taking two binomials and multiplying them together, we now want to take a trinomial and figure out what the two factors are that would multiply to give us that trinomial. So we're going to be breaking these polynomials apart now into two factors. So both of these trinomials have 30 as their constant, so they have a little bit in common, and so we're going to start with this one on the left. So when you are factoring, you want to start with your number one thought is about this leading term. So we have an x squared here. So if we think about two factors that are going to multiply to give us x squared as their first term, we know that each of those two factors must start with an x because those two x's multiply together to give us x squared. So after you think about that leading term, then you want to shift your attention to the end term. So we start with the beginning and then we think about the end. So I'm going to think about the number 30 for a minute. There are several ways to get a product of 30. So we could multiply 1 times 30. We could multiply 2 times 15. We could multiply 3 times 10. And we could multiply 5 times 6. So there's those 4 possibilities for the number 30. So you want to think about that 30 and then consider your middle term. We need our two, so I'm going to go back to the previous slide really quick. We need our two terms together that are in the middle to add together or combine to give us the middle term of our trinomial. So we need to figure out some numbers we can put here and here that are going to help us add up to a 7 in the middle. So if I look down my list, these are the two that look like they could give me a 7 because 10 minus 3 gives me 7. So in my factors over here, I'm going to put in a positive 10 and a negative 3. So what we're kind of doing is the reverse process of multiplying. So I'm thinking about that this gives me a 10x and this gives me a 3x, and together those are the 7x that I see in my trinomial. Now you don't need to write out all of this that I just wrote. I'm just kind of trying to show like what your mind would be thinking about to check your work or to arrive at the answer. But our answer is just those two factors that we have written out. And once we have them factored into those two binomials, we are done. So our two factors are x plus 10 and x minus 3. Now, sometimes people will have it written like this. That's absolutely okay. The order of the two factors doesn't matter. It does matter that the 3 is the negative one and that the 10 is the positive one, but if you put the x minus 3 first, that's okay. But this would not be okay. We do not want it to be x plus 3 and x minus 10. That would be bad because that actually is the polynomial x squared minus 7x minus 10. So that's, or minus 30. So that's just a little bit different than the one that we were trying to factor because of the sign in the middle. Okay, let's try this one that's on the right. So again, I'm going to start by thinking about this. That's my number one spot to think about. I'm going to break that into an x and another x. And then I'm going to shift to thinking about 30. Well, in this case, my middle term is a negative 1. And sometimes it's tricky to see that that's a negative 1 because the 1 isn't explicitly written, but it's a negative 1 in the middle. So on my list of factors of 30 over here, this is actually the combo I want because 5 minus 6 gives me negative 1. So in my two factors, I'm going to write down a positive 5 and a negative 6. And if you ever are unsure if your answer was correct, you can always multiply it out and see. There's an x squared, a negative 6x, a positive 5x, and a negative 30. So when I simplify that, I get the trinomial that I started with. So again, that's just an optional checking step, probably a great idea on a test, probably not necessary to do on every homework problem, but a good idea for a test. All right. So that is what I like to call just some basic factoring. So we're going to look at some other special cases or more advanced ones now. So sometimes you'll see a trinomial that has a number in front of the x. And depending on the rest of the terms, that number in front of the x, there's two different ways of handling it depending on what the rest of the trinomial looks like. So on this first trinomial, you might notice or you might guess that 3 is a factor of all of these numbers because 3 certainly goes into 15. And if you weren't sure if the 3 goes into the 42, you could divide it in your calculator. Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm dividing by 3, not 2. You could divide it in your calculator to see, but 42 divided by 3 is 14. So these are all numbers that have a factor of 3. And when that happens, we call that a common factor or a GCF, greatest common factor. When you have a GCF, you want to factor in 2 steps. You never want to go straight to your factored answer. You want to do 2 steps. Your first step is to get the GCF factored out of all of the terms. So if I factor out a 3 from the first term, it leaves me x squared. If I factor out a 3 from the second term, it's a 5x. And if I factor out a 3 from a 42, it's a negative 14. So your first step is to get the common factor out front, and it's going to stay there once it's out front. And now we're going to go ahead and try to factor our trinomials. So we can essentially ignore the 3 for now. It's there, it's part of our answer, but we don't need to worry about it anymore. So at the beginning we have of our trinomial now, we have an x squared. So we'll treat it as we have our last problems by putting x's in each of our factors. And now we're thinking about the number 14. So the factors of 14 are, or the factorizations of 14 are 1 times 14 and 2 times 7. So in this case, my middle term is a 5x. So I'm going to put in a positive 7 here and a negative 2 here. And again, we do that because we're trying to get a combo that adds up to 5x. So you can see when I add these together, they do give me that 5x. Now you don't need to write that on your paper. You can if you want, but it's kind of just a mental check you can do. Or if you want to, you can write it. Okay, so that is our answer. There's 3, an x plus 7, and an x minus 2. And again, it is okay to have those factors written in reverse order as long as the signs match the answer. All right, so the second one here, 3 is not 19 is not divisible by 3, and 14 is not divisible by 3. So this one is not a GCF. So you have to kind of think about if it's a common factor or not. This one's not. That means the coefficient 3 has to stay with one of the x's, and I usually like to put it in the first one. So we've got a 3x in our first factor and an x in our second factor, and together those multiply to be the 3x squared in the trinomial. I'm having a 14 at the end again. 1 times 14, 2 times 7. And you might look at that 14 list and think, man, there's just no way to get a 19 out of that. And that's because the 3 is actually going to influence what's happening here. So the 3x is going to multiply this number, and whatever number is here is going to multiply this x to make that middle term, or to create that middle term in the trinomial. So for some people, a good way of handling this is to just identify the most likely combination, and you could just write out your two factors both ways. So I could put the 2 and the 7 and the 2, and then just do a little test. The reason I like to write it both ways is so that you're, I guess, keeping track of what you're doing. There's a 2x and a 21x. This one is a 7x and a 6x. I'm not thinking about their signs yet because I wanted to see what they were first. Well, the thing I'm trying to get in the middle is a negative 19. So if these were both negative, that would be negative 13, but that's not 19. This one's not working. So let's look closer at this top one. I've got a 21 and a 2, and I could get a negative 19 from that if the 21 is negative and the 2 is positive. So I need a plus with my 2, and the negative goes with the 7, which helps it build that 21. So, having just a couple different possibilities written out and testing them is a really great strategy if you want to try that. Especially if you're just not sure and you don't have a lot of instinct for it at first, just writing out the possibilities and testing them is great. So this is our answer for our factorization, 3x plus 2 and x minus 7. All right, these two both have only 2 terms, and they look very similar, but they are different from each other. When you have 2 terms, these are the 2 kind of possibilities that come up. The first one is a common factor. So if I look at these 2 terms, they both have a factor of 5 and they both have an x. So we just want to factor out that common factor. And when we do, we have an x left in the first term and a minus 5 in the second term. And I don't have any more powers on my x's, so I am done factoring. This type is a zero middle type of problem. Kind of challenging sometimes because you have to sort of realize that it's not any different than the other problems we've done. It's just that the x linear term in the middle has a coefficient of 0, so we don't see it in the original expression. So we'll factor this like normal now, trying to get it to add up to a 0 middle term. So we'll lead with our x's in our 2 factors, and now we're thinking about that 25 at the end. Factors of 25 are 1 times 25 and 5 times 5. So to get a 0, those 5s are looking pretty good. because I can have a 0 if I have a positive 5 and a negative 5. So that's what my answer looks like. X plus 5 times x minus 5. And again, if you're ever factoring and you're like, I think I got it, but I'm just not sure, you can always multiply together your answer and see if it gives you the trinomial that you started with. And in this case, a negative 5x and a positive 5x cancel out. So it's an x squared minus 25. So our factorization is correct. Okay, so the ones we've been working with so far are expressions. They did not have an equal sign and they weren't equations. They were just expressions that we were trying to factor. But these next few are equations. So we're trying to solve the equations by factoring. So our answer needs to look like x equals, and what we talked about earlier in the year is that this power of 2, one of the things that it's communicating to me is that there are two answers to this equation, and so we'll separate those two answers usually with a comma, or you can list them each separately. So let's start with this 2x squared plus 3x minus 20. If you have a coefficient on your x squared, you do want to see if it's a common factor that you can factor out. But in this case, it's not, because 3 is not divisible by 2. So I'm going to keep that 2 with one of the x's. And now I need to think about that number 20 at the end. The factors of 20 are, or the factorizations of 20 are 1 times 20, 2 times 10, 4 times 5. So we're looking for a combo that will help us get a 3. And these are the trickiest type where you've got that coefficient. So you have to remember that that 2 is going to multiply whatever number that you put over here to help you try to build that middle term of 3. So if you don't have an instinct for where to start, I would just pick a combo, sub it in, and see if you get it. If it's not working, switch it. So maybe I put in a 4 and a 5, for example, and I can test that out and see that that gives me a 4x and a 10x, which doesn't work for the 3 that we're trying to get in the middle. So it's not bad to just write something down and switch it if it's not working for you. So that didn't work. So maybe I try the reverse. I put the 5 here and the 4 here. And I think this one's going to work for us because the 4, if it's multiplied by a 2x, is an 8x. And this gives me a 5x. So if I'm trying to get a positive 3x, I want that 8 to be positive and the 5 to be negative. So that is my factorization right there. And again, that little swoop stuff that I wrote at the bottom, you can write it on your paper if you want, or if you're kind of just thinking through that in your head, that's fine as well. So what we've done so far is the same as the factoring we practiced earlier, but this is solving, so we have some additional work to do now. We know that this factor multiplied by this factor equals 0. Well, there's two answers that make that correct. If this factor is equal to 0, then the product will certainly equal 0, because if I have something multiplied by 0, that gives me 0. So one of my solutions is x equals negative 4. The other solution comes from this factor being equivalent to 0. So if 2x minus 5 is equal to 0, then I have 0 times something equals 0. So 2x minus 5 equal to 0, I need to add the 5. That gives me 2x is equal to 5. And then I need to divide by 2 to get my answer, x equals 5/2. And, certainly you could type that into your calculator and turn it into a decimal, but it's absolutely 100% great to just leave it in factored form or in fraction form. So our two answers are 5/2 and -4. And you can leave it listed like this, or you can list it with a comma. Either of those is fine. So the reason that this process worked great for getting our two answers is in part because our equation was equal to 0. And products that are equal to 0 are easy to solve because we can just set each of the factors equal to 0. So when you have a quadratic like this one on the right side that is not equal to 0, we have x squared minus 3x plus 6 is equal to 30 minus 5x. Before we factor, we want to see that 0 that it's equal to. So we may have to move some terms around, subtracting 30 here to get a 0 there, and then adding 5x to both sides so that that adds up to 0. So the polynomial that I want to try to factor is x squared plus 2x minus 24. So if we think about our two factors of this trinomial, this one starts with an x, so we'll put our two x's here. 24 has lots of possible factorizations. 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, 4 times 6. And we're looking for a combo that will give us a middle term of 2. So I think this one is going to work. That would be 6 minus 4 would give us a positive 2. So we need a positive 6 and a negative 4 in our two factors. So each of the factors gives us one of our answers. If we have this factor multiplied by this factor equal to 0, one of our solutions is that x plus 6 must be equal to 0. So if we subtract 6, we get x is equal to negative 6. And our other solution comes from this factor, x minus 4 equals 0. And we want to add 4 to finish solving that. And we get x is equal to 4. So there's our two answers to this equation. Now, sometimes people are like, do I need to write this out if I can do that step in my head? And the answer is no. If you can do that step in your head, don't write it out. It's fine. But just make sure you remember that your factorization is not where you stop. Like, this is not our answer. 6 and negative 4 is not our answer. Our answer is the 0 or the solution that goes with each of those factors. So you need to make sure you finish to get your two x values. All right, that is it for part 1. This part goes with the front side of the factoring practice 8.1 practice worksheet. So try that for a bit and then watch the second video if you missed class.